We'll be starting in approximately 4 minutes, so that way everybody can get in and get situated before we kick off. Morning, afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you being here. Today we're having our Nerdio workshop, so we'll be discussing that. It's why build an Azure virtual desktop practice and what does Nerdio bring to the table. Today we have Vadim with us from Nerdio who will go through our workshop. I also want to say that if anybody has any questions, please enter them in the question and answer section and we'll get those addressed as we go throughout our session today. So I want to begin with a little background on XenTegra, if you're not aware who we are. Let's go in here to our next slide. So at XenTegra, we are a reseller services and solutions provider. We also do managed services. We do that within your data center, within the cloud. We focus on the digital workspace, and within that digital workspace, one of our key areas is the EUC world. We also deal with security in those environments, as well as giving your users, your customers, better productivity and being able to allow you to leverage more capabilities of business strategies versus that fireman, firewoman reactionary to what user issues are. We work with everything that's out there today within the market, as well as disruptive technologies, and assist you in understanding and being educated in those solutions in the marketplace today. We were founded by Andy Whiteside, who's a former Citrate. And what Andy saw several years ago was the actual gap of an actual enablement for users, for customers from partners of these large vendors. And that's where we come into play. We really are an enablement organization where we're working for you to make sure that you're aware of what technologies and solutions are out there, and you don't have to struggle with what's going on. We're also somebody who works not within a vacuum, we work with you in tandem. So we want to be able to make you and provide you an understanding of what solutions are delivered to you, why they're delivered in that way, and be able to maintain and manage those moving forward. Like I said, we work with some of the larger vendors within the marketplace, as well as some of the niche solutions that are out there as well. And it's all that ecosystem of the virtual workspace and being able to provide a sound EUC solution, as well as productivity from published applications and other such things, as well as MDM solutions and management. And like I said, that wrap within the security, making sure that environment's good to go for you. Now, about myself, be hosting today. I'll also be helping out with some of the Q&A as that comes up. I'm John Spallone. I've been with Zentegra for over a year now. I recently came from Citrix, where I worked in the enablement for the global team, where I worked at Citrix Solutions within the cloud, Citrix Cloud, giving EUC in a cloud-based solution. Spent several years there, focused on the enablement of the internal technical resources at Citrix, customers, as well as our partner community. I have over 25 plus years in the market itself, everything from administrator on up to where we are today with consulting and architecture. Some of my key areas of focus are within the cloud world and sphere, as far as those solutions that come out, as well as those disruptive technologies that are yet to come, that you'll be seeing those within the next years or two. I'm an avid dad joke person. I annoy the heck out of my kids with each of those. Trust me, I won't get into that with you. And then I also find that balance of being able to be a geek, a nerd, as well as a techie. So if you ever run into me in person, please feel free. We can have any conversation at any level for anything. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this over to you, Vadim. So let me make sure I stop sharing. And again, I just want to point out anybody that questions, please put those in the question and answer section. So that way we can keep track of what's going through there. But with that, Vadim, thank you for today. I appreciate your time. I know, you've got a lot on your schedule. So this is great for our community to have you here today.
It's great to be here, John. Thank you for inviting me to lead this workshop. Looking forward to today's discussion. Looking forward to the audience's questions if you have any about Azure Virtual Desktop, about Nerdio, and let's dive in. So as John mentioned, today's workshop is about building an AVD practice within your organization and what Nerdio brings to the table. So this is going to be a fairly technical session. We're going to look at architecture. We're going to look at some of the Nerdio manager capabilities around auto scaling and cost optimization, image management, and some of the new functionality that's actually launching today in Nerdio Manager that I think those of you who work with Azure Virtual Desktop will find quite interesting. By way of background, my name is Vadim Vladimirsky. I am the founder and CEO of Nerdio. As John said, I'm also a geek and a nerd. I like technology. I was one of the original product architects. So anything technical related, if you want to ask regarding our products or what we do, I'm more than happy to answer that. So with that, let me share my screen and tell you a bit about the product that we are going to be talking about today. And that is Nerdio Manager for Enterprise. And what Nerdio Manager for Enterprise is, it's a modern cloud-first desktop as a service deployment management and optimization platform that aims to do two things. Number one, minimize the cost of virtual desktops in the cloud, and equally, if not more importantly, reduce the complexity involved in building, maintaining, optimizing those types of environments. So really try to make it as easy and seamless as possible. A bit of a background on Nerdio as an organization. We built this product and launched it into preview on March 9th of 2020, which unbeknownst to us was the week that all of the lockdowns happened. So very quickly, the product saw a lot of adoption. We were planning to do a handful of customers who were going to run this in preview for some time. We were going to get market feedback, make changes and enhancements. And what ended up happening is we saw thousands of deployments within that very first year by organizations all over the world, ranging in size from hundreds to tens of thousands of users. And what that allowed us to do is get a lot of market feedback around functionality, what was needed, what was working, what needed to be enhanced, and allowed us to revise the product many times since then. We do a new release about every 4 to 6 weeks, and almost exclusively all of the new functionality we add is driven by our customers and partners who are using AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, in production in the field. And these are all very real world scenarios that we're trying to simplify and optimize from a cost perspective for our customers. Nerdio Manager, as I mentioned, is a DaaS platform. It currently supports 3 types of DaaS hosting technologies. One is obviously Azure Virtual Desktop. Windows 365 is something that Nerdio Manager helps deploy and manage as well. That's supported within the product. And more recently, we launched support for Azure Stack HCI, which is a way to do Azure Virtual Desktop on premises for those customers who need data residency to be local and who need maybe to reduce the latency between their applications and the virtual desktops. So at the high level, that's what Nerdio Manager is. Now, where does it add value? And in order to answer that question, I find it helpful to explain where it fits into the technology stack of AVD. So if you think about AVD, it's got four core pillars or four core components to it. There's the client application that Microsoft creates for all the various client platforms, Mac OS, Windows, all the mobile platforms. There is a new version of Windows 10 and 11 operating system that supports multi-session capabilities. So users can get true desktop class OS experience. There is the admin experience, which used to be all PowerShell based and is now Azure Portal based out of the box. And there is a set of services that Microsoft provides that are the PaaS services that enable AVD. And these includes things like gateway and brokers and diagnostic services and everything that Microsoft hosts on behalf of its customers. Where Nerdio Manager fits in is that it extends the admin experience of AVD, but without replacing the core components of the control plane. So Nerdio Manager is not a replacement or an alternative control plane to AVD. Rather, it's an AVD extension that provides enterprise class management capabilities, auto scaling capabilities, and a lot of the things that we'll be looking at today. And those advantages or those capabilities fall into three primary categories. The first one is all about cost optimization, making sure that the Azure spend is as efficient as possible. And we're not talking about the reduction of 10-20% from the costs. We're talking about 50 to 75% on average that we're seeing across our customer base, with some customers seeing north of 80% savings. And this is savings in hard dollars on the Azure costs themselves. And we'll get into a lot more detail as to how that works and what it actually looks like from a configuration perspective. In addition to the hard dollar savings, there is also the increase in IT admin efficiency. So administrators who may not be expert in Azure, who may not be expert in VDI, or maybe teams that have a small number of such experts can manage very large environments through the use of Nerdio Manager, because it simplifies and automates and kind of makes everything really easy and simple when managing AVD through Nerdio Manager. The second category is all about automation and orchestration to increase reliability of virtual desktops in the cloud. I would say the most popular or common feature in this category would be around image management. Image management is very powerful and flexible in Azure, but it does tend to be pretty complex. And most customers struggle with image management, especially at scale, once they go live, and those images need to be updated and patched and rolled out and backed up and versioned and tested. So there's a lot that goes into image management, and doing it natively through Azure requires a lot of scripting and a lot of complexity. So Nerdio Manager brings together a complete lifecycle management of the image, from creation to application deployment to testing and rollout and regional replication and ongoing patching. All of that is completely automated with a very easy point and click interface, as you will see in a few minutes. We also provide the ability to enable disaster recovery on AVD. And what that does is it effectively spreads out the AVD workload across multiple Azure regions to tolerate a regional failure. So if one of the Azure region fails, then the second region can continue supporting users with no interruption. There's no failover that you need to go through. This is more of an active DR type of a setup. We also have a self-healing engine, and what that does is it monitors the health of the underlying AVD environment and looks for problems on session hosts, on Windows, and can take automatic remediative actions to fix the problem without having to wait for a user to report it and without having to have an administrator go in and manually fix issues. So this is a very powerful way to get users up and running very quickly without any admin involvement. And then finally, the third category of benefits is all about that simplification that I talked about. AVD is very broad. Azure is extremely diverse, complex, and flexible. And Nerdio Manager really simplifies both the initial deployment of AVD as well as the ongoing management by unifying all the Azure components that go into virtual desktops in Azure, everything from storage and host pools, and diagnostics and monitoring and log analytics, and all of those types of components are all brought together into a single UI managed in a very easy point-and-click way, along with very capable APIs for third-party solution integration. And then the final component in this category is we also help with application management that allows for installation of apps to images and host pools, as well as delivery of things like MSIX applications to host pools. So with that, let's move on and focus on one of the areas that we mentioned, and that is the cost optimization. So if we look at, well, what makes up the cost of a typical AVD deployment, we'll find something that won't be surprising to anyone, but that is the compute and the storage costs of an AVD deployment make up over 90% of that cost, right? So you have your VMs that are running the session hosts, you have the operating system disks that are attached to those VMs, and then you have the storage of FSLogix profiles, which is typically done on Azure files or Azure NetApp files. And those are the three areas where Nerdio Manager focuses a lot of its technology on optimizing and dramatically reducing the cost of an AVD deployment. Let's look at this a little bit more specifically. So on this slide, we're going to be looking at a very commonly deployed sort of a representative multi-session AVD environment. We're going to make a few assumptions, but these assumptions are common and typical, and the size of the environment and the costs associated with it scale very linearly as you go up. So this, we're going to start with the assumption that there are going to be 192 users in this environment, but if this is 1,000 users or 500 users or 10,000 users, the per user costs and the percentage savings are going to be exactly the same. We're going to make the assumption that we are going to have a heavy user type, meaning that there will be 2 users per virtual CPU on this environment. We'll be using an 8-core, 32 gig of RAM, Intel-based version 4 VM, the D8 SV4. We're going to attach a premium SSD, 128 gigabyte disk to this VM. We are going to assume a 20 gigabyte profile size for these user profiles. We're going to store those profiles on Azure Files Premium, and we are going to assume that users work an average of 50 hours per week in this deployment, and the pricing will be based on US South Central Azure region. And what we see here is that if you deploy this type of an environment in an unoptimized way directly out of the Azure portal, what you'll see is that it's about $5,000 per month with roughly $26 per user per month on average, which is a pretty good price point for everything that's included, right? This is infrastructure and this is the AVD service itself. But we can, as you can see down below, we can see significantly better with cost optimizations. And we've selected, or I've selected 6 cost optimizations to demonstrate to you here. The first 3 focus on compute optimization, and the next set of 3 focuses on storage optimization. This is not an exclusive list. There's other things that we can do in Nerdio Manager to drive the cost down even further, but these are definitely the most popular ones. So let's start with the first one. The first one says VM power management. And I think this is the most obvious and intuitive one. And what it does is make sure that the right VM is on at the right time, so that when users are not using VMs, it gets shut down. When the users need it, it gets proactively powered on, and it optimizes the compute costs of those running VMs by shutting them down when they are no longer needed. However, even with power management, there are some costs associated with the disks that those VMs are using while they're powered off. And this is where the second optimization called just-in-time provisioning comes in. What this does is it allows you to specify how many of your VMs should be treated as burst capacity. What that means is those VMs will get created on demand as needed to replace the ones that were just consumed by the users. And then at the end of the day, they will be automatically deleted and cleaned up from the environment. And the advantage to doing this is twofold. There is number one, a cost savings from not having to maintain those disks that you are paying for even when the VM is powered off. And the second benefit is that you're constantly refreshing your session host VMs by spinning them up and deleting them from the image. So your set of VMs is almost always up to date, and there isn't the configuration drift that's happening, putting VMs in an inconsistent state that could introduce problem for the users. The third optimization that has to do with compute is called the reserved instance analytics. And reservations in Azure, as I'm sure all of you are familiar, is a way to commit to a certain amount of CPU capacity in a specific Azure region in exchange for a significant discount. There's 1 year reservation and 3 year reservations, and 3 year reservations gives you about 60% savings on the cost of compute, but you are committing to running those VMs or at least paying for them for 24/7 usage. And typically people don't think of auto scaling and power management in the same context as reservations, because if you're reserving capacity, well, what's the point of actually managing the power of those VMs and turning them on and off? You're prepaid for that anyway. But the answer is that auto-scaling in and of itself is generally more cost-effective than reservations because that typically saves north of 70%. However, there is still some amount of baseline capacity that's being consumed even with auto-scaling. So if you take into account, the minimum number of users who are always logged in, as well as the usage patterns, sort of that cyclical daily active users and smaller number overnight and on the weekend, there is certain amount of CPU that's being used consistently over the course of the month. The difficult thing to know is, well, how much CPU is that? How many CPU hours are actually being consumed on a monthly basis? And that's where Nerdio Manager comes in. What it does is it helps analyze auto-scale behavior for the past 30 to 60 days and make a recommendation as to how many CPU cores of what type of VM and in what Azure region you can reserve to actually decrease the cost even more on the compute. So that's the last of the compute optimizations that I'll talk about. The next three have to do with storage optimization. The first one here is called operating system disk autoscale. And if you'll recall, in our assumption here, we're going to be using a premium SSD disk, 128 gigabytes for each of these session hosts. And this is a very high performance but high cost disk. Now, why would we want to use it? Because we want to give our users the best possible experience while they're logged in. So when they're logging in, logging out, running applications, we want them to have the best possible experience. So the cost is really justified. However, when that VM is shut down and that disk is just sitting there doing nothing, paying for premium SSD is fairly wasteful because nobody's benefiting from the performance that comes with premium SSD. So what Nerdio does with its auto-scale of operating system disks is it converts that premium SSD disk to a much cheaper standard HDD disk, which is about 75% less expensive. And that gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you the highest performance while users are logged in with the lowest cost while users are not using the system. The next storage optimization is related to the disk size. Obviously, the bigger the disk size, the more expensive it is in Azure. And it comes in this discrete sizes, 32 gigs, 64 gigs, 128 gigs, 256, etc. And the default disk size that comes from an AVD image from the Azure Marketplace is a 128 gigabyte disk. But if you boot it up and take a look at that VM, you'll see that more than 90 gigabytes are actually free. So what that means is you can easily shrink down a typical Azure VM image that's used for your session host deployment down to 64 and save more money on the storage. So that's something that Nerdio Manager can automate for you as well if you want. And then the final storage optimization we'll talk about is the FSLogix compression or shrinking. And FSLogix is a profile containerization technology. It takes the user's Windows profile from the C drive, encapsulates it into a VHD file, and places that VHD file on an Azure file share in Azure. Now, these VHD files are what's called thin provisioned, which means that as users are adding data to them, they are growing, but they're never actually shrinking. What that practically means is if a user goes in and downloads something, which gets placed in their downloads folder, which is part of their profile, the VHD file that contains their profile will grow. And then even if that download is deleted, that VHD file will never shrink. So what typically happens in unoptimized FSLogix environments is that the FSLogix disks keep growing and growing and growing over time, even though the usage is a small fraction of what's actually consumed on disk in Azure Files. And the cost of Azure Files is based on how much capacity you have allocated to it or how much quota you've given it. So you're paying for a lot of white and empty space. So what Nerdio Manager does is it can go into these FSLogix containers and it can compress them by removing the white space from within the VMs and reduce them by at least 50%, and in most cases even more than that. And then once those files are reduced in size, it will go into the Azure Files premium share and automatically adjust the quota so that you actually see that savings on your Azure bill. So if we put this all together, you can see something pretty dramatic. You see that our cost goes from a $26 per user per month average with an unoptimized deployment down to less than $5 per user, which is a whopping 83% savings relative to kind of an out-of-the-box deployment. And you can easily see that, at this price point, AVD may be deployed as a small pilot or a more kind of a niche use case, whereas at this price point, it can really be deployed very widely across the organization for all sorts of use cases. So these are some of the cost optimization technologies that Nerdio brings to the table to help drive very significant cost savings. As a matter of fact, if we look at across our customer base, we find that a typical customer pays for their Nerdio license within 6.5 days of each month, just with autoscale savings, base savings. So the Nerdio license basically is covered with autoscale savings in less than a week. And then the remaining savings throughout the rest of the month are net new savings that drop to the bottom line and really help increase the efficiency and save costs for our customers. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions that I can answer. So let me.
Sure thing. Vadim, we had one question come up, and I'm pretty sure you covered this, but I just want to circle back around. Are these cost savings percentages derived from managing pooled instances of AVD? And are there efficiencies to be gained in dedicated, persistent, always-on AVD environments?
Great question. And let me answer that in some detail. So this example is assuming multi-session. So the specific calculations is multi-session related. But in Nerdio Manager, we do quite a few things to help with personal host pools and savings there as well. Let me give you some examples. So power management is certainly one that applies across both pooled and personal. Just-in-time provisioning does not apply to personal because you can't remove personal VMs and recreate them. However, in today's release of Nerdio Manager 4.2, we have a feature called Auto Grow on personal host pools. And what that lets you do is it lets you assign a bunch of users to the host pool and create only a small handful of VMs and say whenever the number of unassigned or unused VMs falls below a threshold, whether it's 3 VMs or 1 VM or some percentage of the total, add additional VMs to grow the pool automatically. So as users log in, those VMs will get automatically provisioned for them as they're being consumed. So it's still kind of just-in-time provisioning, but not so much from an auto scale up and down perspective, more in terms of growing it. We also have a feature coming called auto shrink. And what auto shrink will do is it will monitor the usage of personal desktops. And when it notices that the desktop hasn't been used in an extended period of time, let's say 30 days or 90 days, and administrators can configure this obviously, it will first put that VM into kind of a cool down period where user cannot log in and see if the user complains that, oh, hey, I haven't been able to log into my desktop. And then once that period expires, it will actually remove that desktop and clean it up. Because what we see a lot in personal desktop deployments is that they tend to, sprawl and get out of control. There's a lot of VMs that are unused, and it's, it's a manual process to determine what are they and how to delete them. So this automates both the growing process as well as the shrinking process as users come and go and are no longer using their personal desktops. Reserved instance analytics absolutely applies to personal desktops and is a great use case, even better than for pool desktops. Operating system disk auto scale is much more impactful for personal host pools because there are just more disks in that environment because each VM is relatively small. So the ratio between the storage cost to the compute cost is actually higher. So the impact of savings is high. Reduction of disk size absolutely applies, and FS logic shrinking applies as well. So although I don't have any numbers that I can specifically share with you, it will still be in very high, certainly north of 50%, probably close to 70% savings, even for personal host pools. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, that's all we've got so far, Vadim.
All right, excellent. Thank you, John. All right, so the next thing I want to jump into is briefly talk about the architecture of the product and where it gets deployed and what the components are, because I think it's an important thing for most of our customers who are very security, compliance, data residency kind of focused and value those components. So Nerdio Manager is not a service. It is not a software as a service that is hosted by Nerdio. Rather, it is an Azure application which is published to the Azure Marketplace and is deployed from the Azure Marketplace directly into the customer's own Azure environment. So this is a single customer application that's completely cloud-based. It's based on, out-of-the-box app services. The deployment is totally automated. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes for all those resources to get deployed from the marketplace. And they're PaaS services only. So they're not, there's no VMs, there's nothing to manage from a VM perspective. There's no infrastructure. It's just things like an app service, a key vault, an SQL database, Azure automation, etc. The other thing that Nerdio Manager does is it doesn't require any network connectivity, meaning it doesn't need to be plugged into any of your VNets. It doesn't do anything over the network. Rather, everything it does is through Graph API provided by Microsoft. It uses Graph API with a very limited set of permissions to integrate with Azure AD without any ability to make changes, and integrate with whatever subscriptions you are using and the resource group within those subscriptions that you're using to host your AVD deployment. Nerdio has no access into any of our customers' environments. So from a security perspective, that's extremely locked down. I mean, you certainly can entitle external guest users to come in and do management if you'd like, but by default, it's locked down to just the customer environment only. And the only thing Nerdio receives is license usage information, so sort of aggregate counts on how many users have logged in, etc. In a very anonymized. There's no user information. It's just counts themselves, and that goes to our licensing service, which is what facilitates our ability to bill for this on a consumption basis. So this is a typical what we call single tenant deployment architecture. Very simple, very easy to do, and is very secure and not multi-tenant, not hosted by Nerdio on behalf of multiple customers. However, Nerdio Manager supports not just a single tenant deployment, but also what we call a multi-tenant deployment. Now, multi-tenant in this context doesn't mean multiple customer tenants. It means multiple tenants of the same customer. So it's still a single customer solution, but it does support multi-tenants. As a matter of fact, it supports multiple Azure clouds. So you can see here in the yellow box on the left, we support both Azure Global, which is often the host of the GCC identities for government customers. It also supports Azure Government and GCC High. It supports Azure China. It supports Azure Stack HCI now as well. Even though it says coming soon, it has actually formally launched a few weeks ago. So what this allows you to do is deploy Nerdio Manager into any of these clouds and then connect to AVD environments across any of these clouds. So that means a single instance of Nerdio Manager can manage a cross-cloud, cross-Azure cloud, right? Not cross other vendor cloud, but cross Microsoft Azure cloud deployments of AVD. This is very commonly seen in government organizations who may have their identities in GCC, but who want to put their AVD workloads and VMs in the Azure government subscription. And this is fully enabled and super easy and automated to do through the Nerdio Manager. So that is the architecture. That's all I have as far as kind of background and slides. And the next thing I'd like to do is jump into the product itself and show you how it works. I'll pause to see if there are any questions while I switch my screens here.
We're good to go to move on. Nobody has anything at this time?
Excellent, excellent. So in that case, let's go right into the Nerdio Manager and take a look at the UI, and we'll go through some examples of what can be done and how this tool actually works. So the first thing you'll notice is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a unified management platform. So everything on the left side here are all the different modules of what Nerdio Manager can manage. So obviously, dashboards and reports are all part of this. We can have various help desk functions, management of workspaces and host pools and sessions. We can manage the AVD Classic or the Classic WVD environment. We have Windows 365 management. We can manage desktop images, MSIX app attach, library, and delivery. We can manage scripted actions, which is a super powerful way to customize your AVD environment to really be fully automated in your deployment, monitoring, storage, role-based access controls, notifications, logging, etc. So everything is really under a single umbrella, all within an easy-to-use UI. What we'll do today is we'll actually go through the process of creating a workspace, creating a host pool, looking through how auto-scaling works, and then spend some time on what an image management process may look like. So let's start out on the workspaces page, and I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new workspace. I'll call it 0715 workspace 1. We're going to select the North Central US region, which is where we're going to put this new workspace, and click OK. This is going to create our new workspace. And as I clicked OK, this is actually going into Azure and through the Graph API, creating those objects. So if I were to open the Azure portal side by side, I would see sort of the same type of resources being created as I'm going through this here. Now we have this workspace created. We can click on it to open it up. And what we'll notice is we have 3 sets of host pool pages here. We have something called static host pools. And these are the native AVD host pools that you may already be familiar with. They're basically collections of session host VMs that an administrator can manually add to or remove VMs from, but there's no kind of auto-scaling automation there. And then we have something called dynamic host pools, which is a unique Nerdio concept that takes the static host pool and extends it with auto-scaling and image management, golden image capabilities. And that's the one we're going to look at today. I also want to briefly mention we have something called hybrid host pools, and hybrid host pools page will appear if your environment is integrated with an on-premises Azure Stack HCI cluster. And if so, you'll have the ability to create a HCI host pool, which will put those workloads on premises rather than in the Azure cloud. And all of this can be managed in a very consistent and unified way from a single UI. So let's go into our dynamic host pools page. We're going to click on add dynamic host pool. We're going to give it a name. Let's call it 0715 host pool 1. And then we're going to go down to the desktop experience selector. And here we have 4 options of the type of desktops that we can deliver. The first one is what's called a multi-user pooled desktop, and is probably the most common way that we see AVD used. We can also do a multi-user pooled remote app, and these two can be mixed and matched off of the same image and the same host pool. And then we have 2 types of single user desktops. We have personal single user desktops, where it's basically a persistent VM that's assigned to a specific user and belongs to that user for the life cycle of that VM. The user can only log into that VM and no one else can use it, and it's one-to-one. But there is another type of single user desktop called pooled single user desktop, where each user gets their own dedicated VM, but only for the duration of the session. Once that user logs off, that VM goes back into the pool. It can get refreshed and sort of reverted back to its image state and be made available to the next user. So you need far fewer VMs in this scenario, but you also don't have that persistent assignment either. So you have a choice of the type of single user desktop to provide to your users. For our example, we'll go with a multi-user pool desktop because that's certainly the most common one. The next thing we'll do is we'll select our directory profile. So the way Nerdio works with directories or identity sources is it supports Active Directory, it supports Azure ADDS, and it also supports the native cloud-only Azure Active Directory. Each of those can be created as a profile with, maybe different credentials, different forest or domain name, different OUs, and you can designate one of them as the default and have as many profiles as you want. So you can see in my lab here, I have a ton of different profiles, some Azure AD, some Active Directory. My default profile happens to be an AD profile, an Active Directory profile, and that's what I will use for our example here. Then we have a selection for FSLogix. For FSLogix, we can do a couple of things. We can either turn FSLogix off, pretty uncommon because FSLogix is used pretty much in all environments, certainly in multi-session pooled ones. Or we can point to an FSLogix profile. An FSLogix profile contains all the FSLogix configurations. It contains the path to the storage location, whether that's Azure Files or Azure NetApp Files or even multiple locations, and it handles the replication between those locations. So basically, Nerdio handles FSLogix start to finish, from installation of the FSLogix binaries and upgrading them when new ones come out, as well as the configuration that's done as well. So you never have to use group policy, you never have to make any registry changes, do anything at a VM level. Everything done is at the host pool level through a defined profile. And here I'll also select my default profile, which happens to be on an Azure Files premium share. Then we go in and we define the naming convention for the session host VMs that will be created. I'm going to specify 0715A. And what this lets us do is it lets us select either this as a prefix, which means that a unique suffix will be appended to these VM names and will be the name of the VM in Azure, as well as the computer object in Active Directory. But we can also use a more advanced naming pattern. If we use a pattern, we have a way to specify sequential numbers. So for instance, we can say something like, like that, and that means it's going to use 000 through 999 sequentially. We can also use numbers, inside of the name itself. We can use, a question mark as an indicator of a pseudo-random number. So we have a lot more advanced capabilities, but the easiest thing to do is really use a prefix type of a design where you just specify your prefix and Nerdio Manager handles making that unique for you. The next thing we do is we select our network. So the network selector will show me all the various networks I have in all the different regions that I've selected to make available here, and across all the different clouds and subscriptions that I have. So you'll notice I have this Azure Global subscription that has different regions. This one is North Central, this one is South Central, this one is UK South, etc. But I also have an Azure Government subscription here, and this network happens to be in the Virginia region, and I can use that as well. So by choosing my network, I'm basically telling the system which Azure cloud, which Azure tenant, and which Azure subscription, and which Azure network I want to place my VMs into. For this demo, I'll go with a north central network that I have selected here in my lab. And what this will do is automatically assess how many IP addresses are currently available, how many are used. And if this is a too small of a number, it will automatically detect that and warn the user that there may not be sufficient IPs. The next thing we do is we select our desktop image, right? What image are we going to use to actually create these session host VMs? And in my lab environment here, I have a very extensive list of images, but I will just show you what the different categories are, and then we'll talk about image management in more detail further down in this workshop. So at the top, we have something called Nerdio managed images. These are the images we'll be talking about when we get into that section. So we'll skip that for now. The next section of this dropdown is the Azure Marketplace images. And this is the Microsoft maintained and published images that are available out there in Azure. And you can see all the various operating systems, all flavors, all revisions and builds are all listed here, including the Cloud PC optimized single session images. So all the different OSs are here. It will also see all of your custom images that are available within your Azure subscriptions that are linked here. Also, all shared image gallery and compute galleries are listed, etc. So for this example, I'm going to go with the latest version of Windows 11 with Office Pro Plus Gen 2 multi-session VM. So that's going to be the starting point for my host pool. The next thing I will have to select is my VM size. So my VM size is selected from a list of curated VMs that sort of makes a recommendation to me as to what type of VM I want. So here you see by default, I have what's called the general use AVD VM selected. What it will do is it will analyze, well, what is available in my region? What is available for my subscription? How much core quota do I have for each of these VM types? Which is the latest and the most cost-effective version, and provide me the specific options at the top. So you can see here, it's giving me the latest version sorted by what is most cost-effective and based on core quota availability. So if I mouse over, it actually will tell me how many core quotas I have. So let's say if I wanted a 4-core VM, I'm just going to type 4-core, and here are my options. I can go with an AMD-based version 5 VM, which is going to be 17 cents an hour, or I can go with the Intel-based one, which is going to be 19 cents. So for this example, I'm going to choose a 4-core, 16 gig of RAM VM. That's going to be 17 cents per hour when that VM is running. The next thing we'll do is go to select our operating system disk. And here the story is similar. We have a couple of different rules here. And by the way, these can be customized any way you want. So if you want to limit what's available in your environment, if you want to use specific types of VMs, maybe you negotiated a special deal with Microsoft on certain VM types, you can customize what is available and presented when host pools are created or when session hosts are added in the future. Same thing with disks. We're going to go ahead with a P10, which is a 128 gigabyte premium disk, and it's going to cost us 3 cents per hour. Then we'll select a resource group, which is going to be my demo resource group. And here we can even begin assigning our users, or more commonly security groups, to this host pool. So by the time we're done with this process, users will literally be able to log in within minutes from now. So I'm going to go ahead and select a group, and I'm going to go ahead and select a specific user as well. We can also apply tags to this host pool. And when we apply tags to the host pool, it doesn't only apply to the host pool object itself, the resource, but everything associated with it. All session hosts, all network cards, all disks, all app groups, extensions, everything that is tied to this host pool will be automatically tagged the way we specify. And as resources come in and out of that host pool, so as that just-in-time provisioning is creating and deleting VMs, all the tagging will remain consistent based on what you specify. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and this will go into Azure and create all the resources we've selected. But what you'll notice is even though we specify the host pool name and the network and the image and the VM size, we provided all the parameters, but the one important thing we did not specify is the number of VMs that we actually want to create, meaning the size of the host pool itself. How big is it? Is it 1 VM? Is it 100 VMs? And the reason for that is because the size of the host pool in a dynamic host pool environment is typically driven by autoscaling. Now, it doesn't have to be. You can turn autoscale off and add VMs and remove VMs manually. But typically, the reason you're doing dynamic host pools is because those host pools are automated in terms of their size. And that is why the Manage Autoscale page came up right away as we created the host pool. And this is where we're going to spend the next few minutes going through all the various options and capabilities of autoscaling. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn autoscaling on. It can be on or off at the host pool level. I'm going to change the number of base host pool capacity from 5 to 3 because I don't need 5 VMs right now. I'm going to click Save. What this will do is begin the provisioning process in the background while we are going through this page. So let's start out on the top left. So what you'll notice on the top left is I have all the different VMs. I have all the different settings that I specified on the previous page when creating the host pool. And you can see that I can change any of these settings at any time. So they're not locked in. I can always change the image. I can change the network. I can change my naming convention. The only thing to note is any changes that I make will apply to newly created or re-imaged host VMs. One thing to draw your attention to is you'll recall the operating system disk we selected was a premium SSD at 3 cents per hour. However, we also now have the option to select our stopped OS disk. Our stopped OS disk is the disk that the VM will use when it's not running. And in this case, we're actually going to have it automatically converted to standard HDD, which is 75% less expensive than the premium SSD. And when that VM powers on, it will convert it back to premium SSD to give us that best performance. So this is, the OS disk autoscaling I talked about, and this is literally the only thing you have to do. You select your running disk, you select your standard disk, stopped disk type, and off you go. It's going to do everything else for you automatically. There is one option here that's not checked by default I want to point out, and this is automatically re-image used hosts. What this means is as follows. Anytime a session host is logged into by at least one user, it gets marked as used. And what this option does when it's enabled is if once a host is marked as used, when all the users log off of it, meaning it's not currently being used any longer, it will be re-imaged from our selected image, can have all the apps installed on it as part of scripted actions if needed, and then that host will become available again for us to use in a refreshed type of state. So this is a way to refresh your hosts after each time that they're used. On the top right, we have a little cost estimator that's sort of a real-time cost estimator that tells us what's going to be the minimum and maximum cost of compute and storage in this environment. And what we mean by minimum and maximum is that minimum cost is assuming that the host pool stays at its minimum size and never scales out. Maximum means what if the host pool scales out to its maximum size and never scales in? And the actual usage is going to be somewhere between these two extremes. And we will track and report on that number for you, but it takes about a week or so of auto-scaling data to be able to start projecting that information so you can see it in the UI. So for now, we just have the extremes, and it's broken down by compute and storage. And this is using Azure real-time pricing API. So as we go through this page and we make changes, these costs will be automatically updated in real time. So kind of keep an eye on that section. You'll see that it gets updated. Good. So now we have this stuff set. The rest of the configurations, you can accept the defaults, and that's going to cover 80% of use cases, but there's a lot of customizations that you can do. The first thing we have to do is define our host pool sizing, meaning how small or big can this host pool be? And the first thing we specify is the base host pool capacity. Base host pool capacity tells the system how many VMs to pre-provision and make available in this host pool at all times. Now, it doesn't mean that these VMs are running. It just means that they exist in this host pool. And in our example, we're going to say, give me 3 VMs to always exist in the host pool. The number of VMs always running is going to be specified by this option. And this is called minimum active host capacity. And this number can be anything from 0 up to the number of base capacity VMs. By default, it's 1, which means that out of these 3 VMs, 1 will be available 24/7 to allow users after hours and on the weekends to be able to log in, and only if needed, add power on these additional ones, which we'll talk about next. And then the final setting in this section is called burst capacity. Burst capacity is that just-in-time provisioning capability that I mentioned. Here you can specify any number. For example, I can say 25 hosts in this field. And what that means is that the capacity will be added, but only if there is sufficient user demand to require it. So out of the box, these don't exist at all, and they only start being created when they are needed. And we'll talk about how the system knows when that time comes. So what we've just configured is that the minimum size of this host pool is 3 VMs. The maximum size is 28, right? 3 plus 25. And the minimum active host capacity is 1, which means 1 is always running. And the maximum running is up to 28, again, 3 plus 25. Now, the number of VMs running at any given time is determined by the scaling logic section. The scaling logic section is customized to the type of host pool you are configuring. So in our case, we're doing a multi-session pooled host pool. If we were doing single session or personal, this page would look different because those use cases are slightly different. But in a multi-scale scenario, we can scale in and out, meaning add capacity or remove capacity based on several different triggers. We can scale based on CPU usage, based on RAM usage, based on the number of average active sessions per host, ignoring disconnected ones, based on available sessions buffer, taking into account disconnected ones, or purely on a user-driven type of way, where if a user logs in, the VM turns on, and once the user logs off, after a few minutes, the VM shuts down again. So, and you can combine multiple of these triggers by using what we call the multiple autoscale trigger configuration. When you click on this, it gives you the ability to set up multiple triggers so it can scale either on CPU and or on RAM and or on sessions all at the same time. For our example, we use the CPU usage method, and we'll say that when the utilization of the CPU exceeds 65% for 5 minutes or longer, then the system will begin to scale out, which means adding capacity, and is going to do so 1 VM at a time. And this could be any number, really. It could be bigger in larger environments, but in our example, we'll just use 1. And the way that's going to work is it will first power on any base capacity VMs that may have been created, or I'm sorry, the base capacity VMs that already exist and may currently be powered off and stopped, and it's going to keep turning them on. And then once all of them are turned on, then it will see if it needs more capacity, and it will start building automatically this burst capacity. And it will stop doing that. It will stop scaling out either when the utilization settles below this threshold of 65%, or once all of these VMs are created and we are at a maximum of 28 VMs. Now, when the utilization drops, let's say below 30%, and stays there for 15 minutes or longer, then the system will start scaling in, which means removing capacity, and it's going to do so 1 VM at a time. And the way that will work, it's going to first remove any burst capacity VMs that may have been created earlier in the day. And then once all the burst capacity is removed and only base capacity VMs are remaining, it will start powering these down until either the utilization settles above 30%, in which case it's going to stop scaling in, or when it reaches 1 minimum active host, which is the minimum we've specified in this section. Now, you may say, look, I don't want to start scaling in during business hours because users may go to lunch, utilization may drop to 30%, the system will start removing capacity only to add it back in when the users come back an hour later, which is why we have something called scaling restrictions, where you can specify when scaling can run. So for instance, let's say scaling can only run after 6 p.m. And then we have something called scale-in aggressiveness. Scale-in aggressiveness comes in 3 different levels. And what that lets you do is optimize between user experience and cost savings. The default out-of-the-box aggressiveness level is set to high, which gives you the highest level of cost savings. And the way it works is as follows. Let's imagine the utilization drops below 30% and 6 o'clock rolls around. The system says, I need to scale in, and I need to find the next one host to do that with. The way that's going to work is it will find first any hosts that have no sessions on them at all, like they're empty, and we'll scale those in. Then it's going to look for ones that have disconnected sessions only. And once only active hosts are remaining, it will pick the one that has the least number of active sessions. It will place it in drain mode. It will send a message that you can pre-configure to the user telling them that there's maintenance going on, log off and log back on. When the user does that, they're going to end up on a host that's not in drain mode, and they will be able to continue working. Then after this many minutes, the system will automatically log the users off, anyone who hasn't logged off kind of themselves, and scale in that host. And you may say, look, that's great, but I don't want to be that aggressive. I don't want to ever disrupt active users, even if it's after business hours, and even if they can resume working right away. In which case you have other options. You can select medium aggressiveness, which will only scale in when there are no active sessions whatsoever, but disconnected sessions are fair game. Or you can say, I want to use low aggressiveness, in which case disconnected or active session hosts will not be scaled in until they are completely empty. The next setting we have is called pre-staging. Pre-staging is a super useful feature that allows you to have enough capacity available in the morning when the number of users logging in is quite high and they're coming in at a very high, what we call arrival rate. They're logging in rapidly. So instead of having the system reactively scale out, what you want to do is you want to pre-stage that capacity and make it available from the time the users are logging in. And the way that works, let's imagine your users are working Monday through Friday. So let's select Monday through Friday. They start logging in at 8 a.m. and you happen to know that you need 4 hosts to accommodate that initial rush of user logins. So if you select this type of setting, Nerdio Manager will look at the data historically and figure out how long it will take to spin up these 4 VMs, which in our case means powering on 3 base capacity VMs and building one of the 25 burst capacity VMs. It will start however many minutes before 8 a.m. it needs to do that. And by 8 a.m., it will guarantee that you'll have 4 VMs ready to go. The users will log in, get equally distributed between those VMs. They'll get the best possible login experience that's going to be fast, and they are going to have a good fast login experience. As the day goes on and the utilization continues rising, although more gradually, let's say, then the scale out can kick in at any time and add more capacity as needed. Now imagine it's Labor Day Monday and people are not logging in at 8 a.m. and these hosts are just started, but no one's using them. So the system will wait, in our case, this number of hours or minutes, which is scale and delay. So in this case, it will wait for an hour to see if by 9 a.m. these VMs are actually being used. And if not, because let's say it's a holiday, the VMs will be automatically scaled in. So you're not paying for pre-staged VMs on days when they're actually not used. And then the final thing I want to show you on this page is that self-healing, auto-healing engine that I talked about. So here, the goal is for Autoscale to detect when a session host goes into what we call a broken state. And a broken state is something that you can define. What are some of the examples? A broken state could be one where the VM is running, but the session host status is unavailable. What that means is the users cannot log in, but you're still paying for that VM because it's running. So that's a typical, and the default, that's why it was selected here by default, that's a typical broken state. But there could be other conditions. It could be the upgrade of the agent failed, which is something that Microsoft pushes out those agent updates on a regular basis. It could be FS Logics is detected to be unhealthy. It could be domain trust relationship is lost. It could be the heartbeat is stale for, and it hasn't come in for more than 2 hours, or various other conditions that can be detected by this telemetry. And then you tell the system what remediative recovery actions to take. So first thing you say, okay, well, if you observe a host in a bad state, how many minutes should we give it to see if it resolves itself? So let's say we give it 5 minutes. So after 5 minutes, if the host is still in a broken state, then we can start taking recovery actions. What are some examples? So let's say the first thing we want to do is we want to restart the AVD agent on the VM itself to see if that gets it back into gear and it starts working again. So that's going to be our first step. Now we're going to restart the agent and we're going to wait, let's say 7 minutes and see if the problem is resolved. If the problem is not resolved, then we're actually going to restart the VM itself. Now, this is not done at the operating system level. This is done from within Azure. So the VM is restarted in Azure and see if it fixes the problem. If not, after 7 more minutes, we may want to actually reinstall the AVD agent using the latest version of the AVD agent from Microsoft. So this will reinstall the agent and re-register the host to see if that fixes the problem. And if after 7 minutes that doesn't work either, then we can go in and actually delete and recreate this VM from the image using all of the customization settings that apply when new VMs get built, and basically get that VM back into an operating state completely automatically. So restart the agent first, restart the VM second, reinstall the agent if needed, and then eventually delete and recreate the VM to resolve this problem. So this will allow administrators to not even have to do anything. They can get a notification via email or whatever that says this remediative action has taken place, but this is completely automated and doesn't require any admin involvement. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Save and Close. And when I click on Save and Close, this is going to apply these settings that we just specified to the host pool. And we can see these are the auto scaling settings we selected. And you'll notice that we've asked for a capacity of 3 VMs, but we currently have 0 VMs, 0 hosts, because this is a brand new host pool. And as a result of having 0 currently and 3 configured, the system detected that there is a discrepancy, and it's now working to resolve that discrepancy by actually adding 3 hosts to the host pool right now. So this started a few minutes ago when I clicked the Save button, and it's probably going to take a couple more minutes to complete. But these VMs are currently being automatically added into the environment. If we want to see what's actually going on behind the scenes, we can click this details to open up a complete log, and this will show us all the configuration that's being used for the VMs, the FSLogix configuration that's being used. We can see which image is being used. We see the network interface created, the VM created, it was joined to the domain, monitoring extensions were installed, FSLogix was installed and configured. Now the VM is being restarted. The next thing it will do is install the AVD agent and register it, apply any applications that are needed, and within minutes, we will have a host pool with 3 hosts ready to go that we can actually log into and start working, just minutes from starting this entire process from scratch with a brand new workspace. So I want to take a pause here and take a quick drink and see if there are any questions about workspaces, host pools, auto scaling or auto heal, or really anything else that we've covered so far.
Sure, Vadim, go ahead and take that refresher. Taking a look, we don't have anything right now. So if there's anybody who has a question, please feel free to make sure you're putting it in the question and answer section, and we'll get those addressed for you. But it looks like we're good to go at this point.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, John. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is image management. And we'll start really simply. We'll sort of show what the image management capability is, and then it will get progressively more automated and kind of advanced configuration in this image management section. So again, image management in Azure, as we mentioned, is a very flexible and powerful, but at the same time, complex process that it proves to be a challenge for most large AVD deployments at scale and over time. So we've made a lot of investments into image management to make it a very seamless, easy process to maintain images and create images, etc. In Nerdio, instead of worrying about concepts like sysprep and capture and version and doing things in the Azure portal, the only thing that the administrator interacts with is a VM. So the only thing they need to worry about is what applications are installed on the VM, and that is the only thing they need to configure. Nerdio takes care of all the background processing of that VM, making sure that it ends up as a deployable image completely automatically. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. So the first thing I'd like to do is show you what the process is for creating a new image. And there's three ways to do that. The first one is by clicking on this Add from Azure Library button on the bottom. When we do that, we can give this VM a name, this image, desktop image VM a name. Description, select what network to connect this VM to, because we're going to be logging into it and making changes, presumably. We can select which Azure image is going to be our starting point. So this could be any marketplace image, any custom image, whatever the case may be. We can select it from the list. We can choose our VM size and disk size, the resource group, and then we can apply certain customizations to this VM as it's being created. For instance, we can decide to join it to our Active Directory or not. Some applications may require that the VM where they're being installed is domain joined. In our case, I'm going to select no. We can apply time zone redirection settings automatically. We can apply a specific time zone to be set on this VM if it's being deployed into a region other than the one that's by default configured on those images. We can even install certificates on these VMs that are stored in Nerdio Manager for things like applications. If there are self-signed application certs that are used for MSIX packages, those are also maintained in the library in Nerdio Manager, and you can automatically have them preloaded on your image. Then we have a few additional options. We can provide custom credentials for the local user who's going to be logging into this VM, especially if we're not joining it to the domain. You would want to provide credentials here. If you don't want to use the globally defined defaults, there's a global way to define user credentials for the local admin account, so you don't have to type it in every time. So that's one option. Then we have the ability to geographically distribute this image and use Azure Compute Galleries. We can either create a new gallery by typing the name right here, or we can select an existing gallery and select what regions to make this image available in. So I'm going to make it available in North Central, in East and West US by running this. I'm also going to, let's say, select Windows 11, the latest version of Windows 11. If I do that, a new checkbox will pop up called Use Trusted Launch. Trusted Launch is Microsoft's new sort of high secure environment to make sure the VMs can't be tampered with. So this is also an option you can enable just by checking this box. And then finally, I have the option to run scripted actions. Scripted actions is a very powerful way to customize your environment. In our example here with images, we can install all of our apps directly onto these images. So for instance, if I wanted to install Adobe Reader and I wanted to install Teams and Office, and maybe I want to install Firefox and let's say, I don't know, Notepad++ or whatever, I can do all of that here. I can select the order in which I want to do these installs. And once I click OK, this is going to do everything for me. So start to finish, it will create the VM, it will install the apps, it will create the shared image gallery, put the image there as a definition, replicate it in all the different locations. And the end result after a few minutes is going to be a new entry on this page with a fully deployable image listed that we can start using for our host pools. So that's method number one. Method number two to create a new image is by adding it from an existing Azure VM. Very similar configuration, except instead of selecting an existing image, we're actually going to select the SAS URL of an existing VM disk, which is going to take that disk, clone it, and then convert it into an image. And then we also have the way of cloning an existing image that you have already created in Nerdio Manager. So for example, I have this image called Executive. Maybe I want to clone it and call it Executive version 2 because I'm going to be putting it in a different region or making some major changes. So I don't want to modify the original. I want to do this on a clone. So those are the three ways to create an image. Once the image is created, there are 3 simple steps to managing it. Step number 1 is powering it on. When you click power on, you get the option to back up the VM before you make changes to it, right? Obviously, you're powering it on, presumably to make changes. It asks you to select how many weeks you want to retain this backup. You click OK, and this will take a backup first and then turn the VM on. And that's our step number 1, pretty simple. Our step number 2, once you have a running VM, all you need to do is RDP into it or use your ACCM or Intune or whatever you're using to manage that VM, to install the application and updates or whatever changes you need to make to it. And that's our step number 2, to actually manage the VM and apply the changes. And then step number 3, you click on this button that says power off and set as image and click run now. And what that will do is it will take all the changes that were applied, it will create an image from them, it will replicate it to all the necessary regions, and within a few minutes, you'll have these updates available to deploy to your existing or new host pools. So really straightforward and very simple, easy ways to create a new image, and easy way to manage that image once it exists in your environment. And you can see, especially if for those of you who are managing images through Azure natively, how much more seamless and automated this all is. But this is really just the beginning. Once the image is created and it's updated, that's great, but it doesn't mean that users are automatically seeing all of those changes. You actually need to take this image and you need to apply it to a host pool. And luckily, we now have a host pool that we've created. You can see these VMs are now added, and it now has 3 VMs in it. And you'll recall we selected a marketplace image, which means none of our apps are on this host pool right now. And what we want to do is actually re-image this host pool to some custom image that we have. Let's do that. So we're going to click on the dropdown, which is our action menu next to this host pool. We'll go to hosts. We'll select resize, re-image. And this will give us the option to apply a new image to this host pool. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and use, let's say, our marketing image and apply it to this host pool. We could also change the VM size and the disk size if we wanted to at the same time. We can select what batch size we want to use, meaning how many VMs at a time we want this process to go through. And in our case, let's say we have 20 VMs in the host pool. We may want to do this in 4 groups of 5. Here we can specify how many failures can be tolerated before the process is aborted. So let's say we're going to specify 2 failures can be tolerated, in which case if there's some issues, maybe there's an issue with the image, maybe there's Azure capacity issues, whatever the case may be, we don't want to go through all of our currently functional session hosts and break them in some way. So this kind of is a safety feature to press the stop button if something isn't going right. And then if we click run now, what this will do is it will find those VMs and re-image them right during production. Now, we certainly wouldn't want to do this during the day, which is why we have a scheduling capability. And we can say, look, I want to run this process on Sunday morning at 2 a.m. And I want to do it as a one-time thing. So I'm going to set the recurrence to never. And if I click save and close instead of run now, this will create a scheduled task and perform this operation after hours. Now, when it's doing that operation, I can control what happens with the users who are on the machine. The default setting is, hey, force the users to log off after 10 minutes. As soon as you pick that host to re-image, set it to drain mode so no one else can log in, and send a message to the user telling them, hey, log off and log back on so your VM can be rebuilt. However, you can do something that's pretty cool, something we call opportunistic re-imaging, in which case you will set the force users to log off to never. When you set users to log off to never, it will not force users to log off, and you even don't have to notify them that anything is going on. And you can say, wait for users to log off up to a month, right? And waiting up to a month means that the system will keep watching these hosts, and as soon as they're empty, as soon as no users are on them, it will re-image them. So you may have use cases where you need to re-image things on a regular schedule, and you want to kick your users out when that happens in the middle of the night. Or you may have some environments where you want to be more, gentle and opportunistic about it and only do it when no one is logged in. So both of those options are available. In addition to this, you can set up this re-imaging process as a recurring task. For example, if your images are being patched, let's say 2 days after Patch Tuesday, you can say monthly after Patch Tuesday, let's say 4 days after Patch Tuesday, I want to re-image this host pool automatically. And what that will do is it will create a recurring schedule that will take the latest version of this marketing image that will see how that gets updated over time. And it will apply it to your host pool 4 days after Patch Tuesday every single month. So you can automate that host pool maintenance by just selecting and setting a schedule from this page. So now we know how to create images, we know how to manually update them, and we know how to apply them to a host pool, either as a one-time operation or as a recurring monthly, weekly, daily operation, whatever meets your requirements. Now, how do you update the image in a more automated way rather than powering it on and running updates? So here's what you can do. So let's go under desktop images again, and let's pick a image from the list. So let's go with this guy right here called Citrix Image 01. We're going to click on Set as Image. And instead of clicking Run Now, we are going to turn on a schedule. So we're going to turn on the schedule, and we're going to say every month on, let's say, 2 days after Patch Tuesday, I want you to run the following scripted actions, one of which is going to be, Windows 10, update Windows 10 or Windows 11. It's the same scripted action. And what this will do is on a regular basis every month, 2 days after Patch Tuesday, so the Thursday after Patch Tuesday at 12 a.m., it will update our image. And we can set the option here called Stage New Images Inactive. So instead of making this image immediately active, it will create a new inactive version that can be first tested automatically without it applying to your production users. So let's see what that looks like. When you create an inactive image, you'll see, for instance, I have this marketing image. Let's find the marketing image. And this marketing image has 2 versions. It has an active version 2.0, and it has a staged version that's 3.0. So that means it was updated with a schedule. You can see there is an update schedule set to run. Next time it's going to run on August 12th, and it was updated on July 12th to version 3. Now, how does this staged version get used? So let's jump back into our environment here, and let's create another host pool real quick. So we're going to do staging host pool 1. We're going to do staging 1. Let's select our staging marketing image from the list and click OK. This is going to create just an empty host pool. We're not going to build any hosts inside of it. And what we'll do is we will set up a schedule that's going to first update my staging host pool, which is going to have a group of users who are kind of my testing users or the UAT group of users who are using that host pool on a regular basis. These users, we don't need AutoScale, let's go back out. So here's my new staging host pool. Let's go to hosts, re-image. We're going to select marketing, but instead of using the active version 2, we're going to use the staging version, whatever that happens to be. Then we are going to say, run this on a schedule. Let's call it monthly after Patch Tuesday. Let's do 4 days, since we're doing 2 days for the image to update. 4 days is 2 days later. And we're going to click Save and Close. So what this will do is it will take our staged version of the image, apply it to our staging host pool and get it tested. Then we'll go to our production host pool, and we are going to use the active version of the image. We're going to schedule it to run monthly, let's say 11 days after Patch Tuesday, which is a week later. So it gives us a week to test it, but it will only use the active version. We're going to save and close. And then the next question is, well, how do you make a staged version into an active version, right? So we now have everything set up. We're automatically patching our image 2 days after Patch Tuesday. We're automatically rolling it out to our staging host pool that has a user testing group assigned to it who are working with it. How do you tell the system, okay, the image is ready to go, and can start being used. That's very simple. We'll jump back into the desktop images page. We will go down to our marketing image, and there is an option here called Activate Staged Image. We'll click here. We can save the current version as a backup in case something goes wrong. We can always re-image back to it if needed, and click OK. That will take our new staged version, version 3, and promote it to be the active version. And then a few days later, the production host pool will kick in and re-image itself to this latest version. So we've basically completely automated the image update and patching process by scheduling the image update with Windows updates. And it could be any other applications as well, by applying that staged version of the image to a testing host pool, giving it some time to be validated. The only manual option we have to take is someone has to actually click to activate the image to tell the system it's ready to go, and automatically that image will get applied to the production host pool. So that just shows you, again, the simplicity on the one side, and then the power of automation and orchestration that Nerdio Manager brings to the table. We've certainly only scratched the surface of what's possible here, but hopefully this helps you understand what you can do and how much better the AVD management experience can be, especially at very large scale type of deployments, but really at any size. So I think that's all I have as far as the demo goes today. I think we are almost at time here, so I will hand it back to John to wrap it up.
Thanks, Vadim. All right, let's get in here. I hope everybody enjoyed the content today. And again, Vadim, as always, I appreciate you taking the time and being with us to be able to review these things. So I want to follow up. Anybody else has any last minute questions, please, go ahead and feel free to reach out. Also, if you have any questions that come up afterwards or something you think about after the fact, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be able to help you and get all those questions addressed. Real quick on that note, I want to touch base with XenTegra, our virtual events that we have coming up for the remainder of this month. We have a webinar, our Webinar Wednesday cadence, if you weren't aware of those. We have EPOS coming up on 7/20, Bitdefender on 7/27. Also, our other workshops and boot camps that we have for the remainder of this month. We have the XenTegra user group covering Deep Instinct and Tanium. That'll be on 7/21. It's a lunch and learn, but it's also virtual. And we have our iGel workshop, which will be on 7/28. So you can find all of this information on our page under our events tab, as well as other events we have coming up in the future if you want to participate in anything. We do offer many types of events nationwide, so wherever your region is definitely take a look, and we'd love to have you attend. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. And again, thank you, Vadim, for being here today to address everything with our attendees. And I want to thank our attendees for being with us as well. And we hope you got a lot of information out of this. I hope everybody has a great weekend, and we will see you on Wednesday for our webinars.